For our last lecture in this panel, we have a very special guest from Switzerland. It's Vera Bühlmann. She is now in Austria, in TU Vienna. She was one of my doctoral supervisors, and I'm incredibly grateful that she will join us today. Vera Bühlmann is a Swiss writer and a professor of architecture theory at the Technical University of Vienna, where she directs the research unit Architecture Theory and Philosophy of Techniques. Together with Ludger Hoverstadt from ETH Zurich and Elias Zafiris from Parmenides Foundation Munich, she directs the research group Digital Mnemonics since 2016. She also acts as a co-director of the School of Materialist Research in Tempe, Vienna, Eindhoven, and Skopje. Among her most recent publications are Ethics of Coding, a report on the algorithmic condition with Felicity Coleman, Aislinn O'Donnell, Iris van der Thuin, Mathematics and Information in the Philosophy of Michel Serres, a guest-edited special issue of Technophany titled Techne and Feminism, edited together with Katerina Koltsova, Methods and the Comma, Mathematics of Human Knowledge in Technological Accidental Technologies, edited by Joe Brower and Sjeerd van der Thuin. And forthcoming are Convivia, Filth, Journal for Architectonics, co-edited with Ricardo Villa and Chris Argees, The Digital A Continent, Nature and Poetics, Introduction, New Materialism, Quantum Ideation Across Dissonance with Iris van der Thuin and Felicity Coleman in Methods and Genealogies of New Materialisms, edited by Iris van der Thuin and Felicity Coleman. So please, I'd like to introduce this warm welcome to Vera Bühlmann.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nicola, for this really kind introduction, and to all of you for inviting me, even though I can unfortunately not be there in person. I will try to share my screen. And I would like to say that I'm incredibly grateful now to speak after you, Philippe. I really tremendously enjoyed your lecture, and I agree in a lot of things. Maybe not on the resolutions of the conclusions that you draw, but it would be lovely if we can engage in an exchange soon. Let's see. So the title of my talk, I want to gladly, of course, pick up storytelling, the theme of your conference, since that's where I'm originally coming from. I'm originally studied literature and language, and I could not more agree with the statement from your last talk, Philippe, that we need to free language from its being claimed by a form of general linguistics and linguistics per se. So I don't think we are done yet with language. I also don't think that language is doing everything without us knowing. But storytelling becomes newly important, I believe, and newly in a way that I would call stofflich. So it's a material, it's a notion of temporality that is physical through the light. So I want to take these metaphysical notions quite literal to start with, that it's almost one of the oldest truisms that when we try to say something about the intellect, we always end up with speaking about light and the sun. And I think it actually is significant that today's communication happens through encoding everything into light. Now, this is what the optical fiber cables do, transport things. So we actually translate our speech into light right now that I'm speaking from Braunschweig, actually, near Berlin, to you in Florida. But just as much, if we send electricity, if we send energy, or if we send images, or whatever can be digitized in a materialist sense. So we need to reconsider how to think of time, and with that, of course, how to account for things, and also how to recount tales. So how to tell stories. And what I would like to explore a little in this talk is a kind of a double articulation that links such a notion of tales that are told in the temporalities of time that pass massively, that's how I put it in the subtitle, to a notion of clocking time in the domain of a double scope, namely the double scope of the Analemma. I hope by the end of my talk, this will be less cryptic. So I would like to start, since I'm still not yet free of my intense. I studied a lot of things through the optics of Michel Serres. I don't consider myself a Serres scholar or something like that. What I love about his writing is that it exposes, it liberates so many, in a way, quite plain ideas and approaches from takeovers that had become super distinguished in very territorial kind of ways. And one of the main ideas in his understanding concerns the relation between information and thinking. So I want to put a motto for the talk. It's this one here. When we speak of reason, that's what I would complement the 3 dots in the beginning. We need to think of a bottom of a cornucopia, rich and saturated with material and informational plenitude that represents both the world as it is and the joyful splendor of thinking. I do not see any difference anymore between reality and representation, since the latter is part of the former. So this is very remarkable, no? Reality is part of representation. That's what he says here. So then the question really arises, how do we think about representation, not in a static sense of giving us a kind of a mirror play, but really, how does representation come about? So I would put it in terms of mechanics. How can we think through a mechanics of light, that means an optics, of what this domain of representation could be considered as? And what I would like to propose is to detach from a notion of language, whereby language would express one's individual thoughts, or where it would express universal and objective thoughts. I would suggest to treat language in a way that is exterior to it. So we don't need to identify with the words that we use, also not the ones that we study. And yet we don't need to be comic or cynical about it. So there is a way of, and I have come to call this finding a voice, which presupposes that this voice is independent from the content that we feel we want to say. Now, usually when we say we are trying to find a voice, so of course we have all the representational games. So we try to gain attention. We try to cause reflections and so on, to have a kind of a resonance space. But it is more profound than that. When we feel we need we try to find a voice. Very often intuitively we feel we would know what we have to say. We just don't know how. And this is, I think, a shortcut. It is the shortcut that we need to let go when we detach from this dominant, this hegemonical role that a lot of our cultures have attributed to language in the last, probably around 200 years. So finding a voice means not knowing what one would say in it. Yeah, so it's a kind of an exteriority to what feels innermost to us. This is very difficult to achieve. And when I wrote in my abstract of the talk that it will be about the register of style and how it could become helpful with respect to AI employing design, what I mean is that style wouldn't be characterized by geometrical or by figurative elements, but style would come out of writing in many tongues. And writing many tongues is like when what I do now to you, I speak on the one hand, of course, to you as an audience, from which I am quite detached because I'm not there with you in a room, but also I speak to the people I know more closely, Nicola or Carla, with whom I know much more. So how I address them at the same time, how I address you, or how I think of the topic I'm speaking, these are like parallel parallel voices that need to open up a kind of a consonant space. So the words and the arguments that I actually say, they integrate, they accommodate the many scales, let's say, or scalarities in which one can speak, and I think almost all of us do that all the time. No, we have inner dialogues with a lot of quite distinguished addressees often when we really care about what we do. So this kind of a tuning of many different let's say fields of addressing at one and the same time. Style is what allows those to be consonant with one another, in particular tempers. So the temper would be very different if I would put to the forefront of my head, for example, my doctoral advisor from 10 years ago. No, my style would be very different than when I have you now in mind. So that's what I mean with the tempering. And what I don't know how this could be possible, but I'm sure it is possible to figure out the notion of style that works with harmonics, that can address this kind of temperament, of Stimmung, that is co-present even in the linearity of writing, or of course in the versatility of poetic or of verse, if it's more oriented towards speaking. And this kind of style, I feel, has a lot to do with an old notion that has not been much in fashion recently. It's architectonics. Architectonics, I would like to recover it in its relation to how we can think of the intellect. And this is what I now in the first part would mainly like to focus on. So to think of architectonics and this kind of tempering or a notion of style would basically mediate, if you want, or also integrate, and that means also incorporate how the rational and the free will not only do not contradict one another, but actually make each other necessary in a way that both of them have an open scope or have a certain opening or openness relative to their scope. And the background of why I find this relation, as provocative as it may sound, very timely today, is a recent talk that probably many of you have also listened to. It's the latest conversation between Lex Friedman and Stephen Wolfram, where they talk about the natural language approach and the ChatGPT, so the large language models. And what becomes extremely interesting in the way that Wolfram accommodates the beauty and the promise of the large language models is that it begins to become almost cosmic in its imagination. So he introduces different scales. He would say, for example, that the beauty in the chat model is that it is very wide and very superficial, but not in a pejorative sense, just in a very, but is likely at hand. Whereas the computational language, as he understands it, which is a very specific way of thinking of language, would be orthogonal to it. It would be building towers, he says, but the towers are enormously broad and they're very deep. So he brings in dimensions of orientation of how to build a world model that where these two approaches do not compete with one another, but where they complement one another. And the problem where they can complement one another, I was really excited to hear him say that, is that what we truly actually care for when we are interested in computation, just like when we are interested in thinking, are all things that are not immediately evident. No, so they're not immediately evident. So they involve presuppositions. They involve a speculation where jumping to the conclusion, is the speculation legitimate or is it not? Does it convince us or does it not? Collapses the entire world, the entire cosmic world that actually is contained between them. So it is always about creating an acceptance for considering things that are not intuitively evident, that are far-fetched, that one could obviously also see very different, things of which it is not clear what exactly they have to do with one another. So just to put things into a constellation and to win people to think with about the implications of such a constellation. And his fascination with computation is to use, so his question that became quite obvious, is how can we have a relation to the computer in whichever form, no, the orthogonal or the vertical one, that would help us to cultivate this kind of demonstration that seeks to explore the not evident. He says he has a very drastic formulation. He says, when we argue about simulations, whether they are real or whether they are not real, it's quite simple. If the simulation can make the shortcuts such that it can run in a short time to actually give us a result in a useful kind of time frame, then this simulation does not explore anything that is not evident. It just calculates what is quite evident and has already been anticipated in the presuppositions. If we would start to use simulations to explore the not so evident, we could not find any shortcuts to cut down the time. So the simulation and the reality would not even fall apart. And I find this a very stylish and a very elegant way to bypass these foundational debates, which very often result in doctrinal rigidity. So it is a 4-hour talk, and this also I find significant. No, it's a podcast, but it doesn't make things short; it makes it long. So it's a 4-hour talk, which does not get more. So if you listen 2 hours, it still gets more interesting if you continue. And that kind of thing is extremely rare. And I think it has a lot to do with such a notion of style. We should have, if we had such a notion of style, we could distinguish good conversations, good interviews, good journalism from rather brachial one, no, from tactless one, or from the obscenity that making things plain very often has. So the notion of intellect is at stake. There is another intellect in relation to space, because that's what is exciting about the kind of world modeling that Wolfram starts to introduce in this interview. The intellect and space have, for a long time, much longer than the 20th century, been intimately related. There is a recent book by Catherine Malabou, Morphing Intelligence, where she takes quite serious as a philosopher, how did this actually come about that we perceive intelligence to be something that can be measured? And how to think of this notion of the quotient that makes the measurement possible. It gives, in the beginning, a kind of a history. It says a history, it's actually anatomy of a history of intelligence. No. It's the history of intelligence, anatomy of a conflict. That's how she puts it. And the conflict that is at stake is that, she says, with Renaissance, language has been liberated. I think that's what a lot of the language obsession in our time has been about ultimately, that we celebrate a liberation which has actually happened quite a few centuries ago, namely to begin to operate quantitatively within the domain of language, which was, to large parts, orchestrated around scripture, so around a sacredness of a text that did not allow experimental spaces. And through Renaissance, of course, with the new geometry, with the analytics of projections and the measurement instruments, there evolved a kind of superiority of what used to be called the quadrivium arts to engage with the domain of the trivium, to the language-related domain. And out of this crystallized the notion that tried to separate, basically to desacralize a little bit the notion of the mind from the theological narratives in this name of intelligence. So this is how it was introduced. And what it brought about was a multiplication of how the relation between space and thinking was quoted. So there were literally, it was a syncretistic period, no, with regards to world pictures in the anthropological or in the moral sense or in the religious sense. It was a profoundly syncretistic reality, which provoked then the Enlightenment philosophy to introduce a notion of reason that sets itself apart from intellect. No? So reason would no longer be vernacular and multivalent, but reason would be uniform, and it would be unifying in Enlightenment. And it is out of these dynamics, that's how Catherine Malabou explains the story, that in the 19th century, there are people who actually begin to model how intelligence, which is not reason, could be modeled. So how this kind of pure, quantitative or quadrivium, or also if you want mechanic or exterior way of handling thoughts could be exposed to a kind of evaluation schema. And this is a background to the notion of intelligence that I had not been aware of before I read it in her writing, and it opens up really interestingly an understanding of what was at stake in Bergson's interest, no, with time and free will, where his main critique is almost paradoxically. So he says, if we want to preserve free will, we need to replace the notion of space in regard to intellect with time. And this in this constellation becomes a meaningful step, no, and not an absolute position to think in. So maybe where I would like to bring this to for now is to the notion of translation, because this is also beautiful in Malabou's book here. The translator of her book, so the person who translated from French to English, she wrote a preface which has the beautiful title, Why I Translate So Intelligently, Translation, Métis in the Era of Google Translate. No? And she basically says how this, she embraces with Malabou a notion of intelligence in this philosophical sense, also because for her, it gives a way to appreciate the kind of intellectuality, the kind of intellect that goes into the work of a translator. No, this has been one of the most interesting, but also most difficult aspects of this language-centered philosophy, how to tackle the problem of translation. Because if we treat translation purely mechanically, obviously the kind of intelligence is not adequately appreciated that makes a good translator, no? Because we don't even know what the literal meaning of things are unless we have already formalized the linguistic content. So the combination of code, let's say, in a kind of a tempering speaking, no? A speaking that doesn't express, a speaking that tries to temper what it picks up. No? So it's a speaking of somebody who doesn't want to be an author. It's the speaking of somebody who doesn't want to be original. It's the speaking of somebody who wants to explore what is there and develop a relation to these things that is of his own time, of her own time, in an elegant, in a solid, in a generous kind of way. So speaking and writing in tongues by having an exterior relation to language. I will not say much more to this first part of the title, the tall tales told. No, so if we don't, I don't mean this cynical, and it's a bit difficult because of course tall tales are a notion which in English. So I'm not a native English speaker. So for me, I have a kind of a philosophical interest in the notion of magnitude or grandness or greatness that is attached here to tales. But of course, it means somebody tells something which has absolutely no substantial reality in itself. No, and it's not in that sense that I mean it, but the kind of cosmic modeling that tries to model how we could approach abstraction. There is no way to demonstrate the evidence of these models itself. So they are quite far-fetched, they are very daring, they involve a kind of a greatness or a grandness that is not one that wants to dominate. It's a vastness that they take into account, and it's in that sense of a kind of an exposure to a vastness that one cannot grasp, that I want to think of this notion of tall tales. And in that sense, this kind of cosmic or metaphysical gestures in thinking how to approach abstraction would be told, tales told in such kind of a tallness. But I'm not sure whether it's really a good way of addressing it. Not yet. But what I want to focus on now is how then this could be more than a metaphor, no? This kind of tallness or greatness or magnitude or quantity. And I want to turn to the second part, or the clocking of time in the double scope of the Analemma. So how would then a geometry of such tallness or of such magnitude, how could we think of such a geometry? And for this, just an index to where it is coming from a bit. My book, which will be forthcoming later this month, it will be published, The Digital Continent. There is one motif which is equally difficult and rewarding to address through a focus on language as it is through geometry, and it is the question of death. No, so how can we? So if there is a quickness to thought, if there is a liveliness to thought, there must also be a kind of a latency or a presence or an active relation, let's say, that thinking maintains to death. And, and this sensibilized me for this book by somebody whom I'm not usually very fond of, Siegfried Gideon, because what he is mainly famous for, the book Mechanization Takes Command, in my understanding, precisely doesn't speak of mechanization, but of rationalization. No? So the beautiful story that Philippe Morel just exposed to us, where there is a kind of a different understanding of geometry at stake, is no longer there in the phenomena he describes as a mechanization taking command. But this book here is, I think, much older than the other one. I think it's his early work, and it wants to think about if there is this relation between thinking, between intellect and space. How did architecture start? What were first manifestations of it? So it's not itself the question of a historic approach. It's like an Urgeschichte of the possibility of approaching architecture historically. And what he explores in it is basically temples, mainly. It is temples which make graspable that space, like he wants to foreground. Space is not graspable, no? So space itself is immaterial. It is also impossible to limit it coming from the physical side alone. So its formality is not captured thereby. And the way that we can relate to the intangibility of space involves the temporal and the eternal. So kind of think of those as two poles that could frame the question of death. Interestingly, he's also very much aware that space, insofar as it is intangible but architectural, owes almost everything to light. No? And light is also not directly tangible. So light is that's the whole question of intellect and light. Light involves the entire optics of forming images or ideations, having an idea, contemplating, pondering ideas, finding words for them, accommodating ideas in formulations. So all the processes of symbolizing are at play in this in this setup. And it's with this lens that he studies temples and discusses very often a kind of, so, and I don't mean it pejoratively, I must repeat this, but it's beautiful tall tales about the elements. So a lot of the cults obviously involve a relation to the sun and to the stars, and he tells many stories that would relate to the Grundrisse of the temples. And he raises thereby a question which is captured in a text that I want to recommend and work with a little. It's by a scholar, I don't know, Gloria Meinen. It's a text on the die Tafel. It's like the blackboard, no? So it's where you write things on. And the idea is to think in a materialist way about the mediality of the transparent, neutral recipient of inscriptions. And she brings to the foreground that even immaterial objects have a place where they are produced. And she says, this place is the place where we think mathematically. And this place does not exist, no, in a way that could be bodily experienced. And yet there is a reality to it. So she asks the question, how? Just like Gideon, that's why I place it in parallel to Gideon. Gideon asks about the beginnings of architecture with this interest. She asks about the beginnings of deductive geometry. No? The beginnings of deductive geometry, where she says, so this present goes to the beginnings of deductive geometry in order to find out how geometry purifies its objects and processes from any materiality. So this is so interesting. The purification here is not directly a cultic and a sacred gesture. No, when it is done in mathematics, and that's the one side of it. And on the other hand, it doesn't say mathematics per se gives us objects in their purity. No, so there is a kind of a filthiness introduced into the relation between, let's say, religion and mathematics, or theology and mathematics, which percolates or which mediates this very process of deduction and demonstration, obviously, that results from it. And with this sensibility, she asks about the place where ideas are formed. No, so she continues, even immaterial objects have a place where they are produced. They need a space where they can act without disturbance. What would this place look like? This place would be dust-free, so pure that it would be almost invisible. The place where geometry operates knows no limits, double floors, ventilation, dress codes, temperature gradients, and dust swirls. But it does have openings, airlocks that prepare mathematicians and their objects for their work. Mathematicians seldom wear mouse guards or white kitters, but they do possess very effective techniques of exclusion. That proof, for example, does not protocolate the actual paths of construction, but rather follows an abstract arrangement of knowledge. Namely, the axiomatics of its objects is an unwritten law. So you see how this space where we never really have words for, that would leave it open. No? The words come and colonize. The openness of the beautiful abstraction that space incorporates. But in a kind of an exterior relation to language, she manages to evoke a populated, a vivid, of course, an anthropocentric picturing or ideation of this place, which leaves it open. So let's read a bit more, because it's so unusual to think of abstraction like that. No, so abstraction here is not contrasted. Well, it is in play with the contrast of concreteness, but it's not opposed to it. No, the two work together in a way that is difficult to grasp in the logical relations. So she continues, Greek geometry tacitly evacuated people from their thought ways, and with them also removed any materiality and application. The deductive proof springs from an aseptic environment. The real invention of Greek mathematics, it seems, is not abstraction and ideality. It is rather a specific architecture of exclusion. It is no longer properties that escape any description that come into view, but the place where mathematics forms its statements. This place is a kind of a clean room. In its sluices, all measurements fall away from the objects. Here, Euclid can formulate sentences that are immediately obvious. What is equal to the same is also equal to the other. But when like is added to like, the wholes are like, etc. What is so remarkable about this is that she articulates the domain that perhaps comes closest to what philosophers mean with existence, no, with the nothingness or the void of something that is prior to the relation between being and becoming. So it's a void which becomes articulate in her way of thinking about it. And of course, if we would have the understanding that language expresses everything, this would be absolute absurd, because in a void, you cannot speak of in the language of the void about the void, no? But you have this white, whether you start or whether you end. And that's my suggestion now, to say that this way of thinking foregrounds a role of coding that opens up a space. So where encoding and decoding go together, that opens up a space that was not thinkable before, but is universal from the moment that it is there. Yeah. So it's not generative. It's not. Perhaps it is evolutionary. I don't know whether it makes a lot of sense to approach it through the register of history, because it forms a space that can collect countable time. That is the beauty of it. And this is also what Wolfram was talking about. He was insisting on the orthogonal towers, he called them, of formalisms, because these towers allow us to take shortcuts in our simulation. So they literally embody a kind of an intellectuality that is experience-based, no? That is well worth to trust in. But they stand like islands in a huge ocean. They don't form a continual plate. They don't form a kind of a foundation, or even a continent in the non-Cornucopian way of reason. No? But they are very distributed islands. He calls them pockets of reducibility. And he says, these pockets of reducibility, we now need to start caring for them. So we have the floods and the streaming of the horizontality and the fastness and the quickness of the instant, what is instantly evident and instantly calibrated according to what will be perceived as evident. No, because this is what the ChatGPT does, no? It calibrates into a common sense, which gets firmer and firmer and firmer the more it reaffirms itself. So these towers, or these pockets of reducibility, are the resource to go adventurous into the oceans of this flood, because they give us the indexes to look for how to argue the not evident, no? How to learn to demonstrate what is not evident. So these pockets of reducibility, I would like to relate them to the status that Gideon gives to his study of architectural spaces through the temple. And this by a figure which is drawn by Elias Sapiris. He's a friend and a colleague with whom we collaborate a lot. in a sketch which is very, very difficult to grasp in its implications. So what he proposes is the situation, no? We have a relation of world and self. And when we say we want to be outside, so we don't want to presuppose any structure, we don't want to trust any tradition, we want to be exposed, for instance, as a situation picture when you are alone in the mountains looking at the night skies. You are outside, in that sense, so exposed to a vastness that you don't pretend you can grasp. It is inevitable when you do that, that you make yourself the center of the entire perception that you have. Yeah, so everything is gravitating and is grounded in you yourself as the center, and that's how the outside can be open or too vast to grasp. On the other hand, when we are inside, so this is what Gideon's stories about the temple suggest. When we believe ourselves to be in an inside, and we think of this inside as a universal, as being of a universality, then there is something sacred about that space, no? So there is a place spared out for what cannot be availed over, and it means that when you consider yourself in such a relative interiority, we can never put ourselves in the center. At the center is always the altar. It's always the presence of that which has made the space in which we are. So the way to put this is that when we have an inside perspective, the outside remains as a residue that we cannot get rid of. No, so these stories that she talks about, with so the creation, when we celebrate mathematical thinking in its purity, but we don't claim this purity is an originality. We say, no, this purity needs to be cared for. It needs to be made as best as possible, like it is done here, but it will never be an absolute one. So there is always the outside, and that means also a part of the self-centered or anthropocentric remainder that will be accommodated within. Now, when we have these models of reciprocity, no, where the common sense calibrates around innovative approaches in common sense. When you have these kind of reciprocities that appear to mirror one another, this mirroring gets a different quality when we keep it in mind as an inversion. So not as a reflection, but if there is a kind of not a mirror, but a screen through which the outside percolates. So the optics of the outside percolates to the inside, and the inside percolates to the outside. No, and this will never be a tautology because of the residue which you cannot get rid of, as long as you don't claim this house to be a proper house, but to be the house of the all. No? So a cosmic house, in whichever typology one then wants to address it. So this is a play of inverting orientations that, for me, captures best from everything I have ever read what I associate with abstraction. The gesture of abstraction involves an alienation to our own thinking, which has something to do with such an inversion. So it's an involution as a complementary direction to what we can study empirically in terms of evolution. And we need a well, I don't know if it will be language, but for sure we need words. No, we need words and articulations and formulations to get more eloquent about this interiority, because with regards to the exteriority, we are super eloquent. No, there is a kind of a disproportion with respect to these things. And I haven't spoken about the Analemma yet, so let's do that now. So the idea is to think of what can basically, no, so inversion, this is a movement which is like when you have a sock and you turn it inside out. No, so it's an inside out to invert something means to turn it inside out or outside in. And the membrane, or this thing, no, which allows for inversion, I want to suggest now we can think of the analemma as that. And of the analemma, we can think as a kind of an inverted mirror. So a mirror is not that which oddly or strangely is not affected by what is projected upon it, but it is active. No, it is not passive in this way. And then this analemma becomes the geometric plane as a radiant screen, conceived as a radiant screen. So for those of you who maybe don't have it so present, but the analemma is, it collects the course of the sun over a year. And if we say the projection of the analemma, and we need to think of this abstractly, obviously, it is not evident, and it's not tangible, no? But it's a kind of an operator, I think, or perhaps a quotient to think space, a kind of a quotient of a magnitude that has something to do with this tall tale storytelling. So then the analemma collects all the shadows that a gnomon can cast. So the gnomon is the stick which gives us forms in proportion to one another, because with the gnomon we produce geometric form. So with the gnomon we stop time. No, when the angle of the to the sun is in the right angle, it will always reproduce every day an analogicity and the proportionateness among the forms with which we can do geometry. But now the analemma has something to do with how to sum up all the possible geometric frozen timelinesses, no? Because of course the sun has different angles everywhere, no? So this allows us to think of the stopped temporality as a kind of a vibrant, pixelated fabric or substance, which can perhaps inspire a different way of thinking a contemporaneity, so a presence that would involve a depth as much and a broadness as much as a fastness and a superficiality and a wideness. So this is the invitation I would like to pose with regard to storytelling. And there is one more aspect. So this is the book where, so the thinking about the analemma and the gnomon and so on are developed. It will be published very soon, hopefully already by next summer, by our new book series, which we call the Meridian Architectonics, on mathematical thinking. And what Elias Zafiris introduces here is something that allows to project the architectural space in analogy to the role of the columns in the temples. And he calls this the keystone. He calls it the meteoron. So, and the meteoron is the stone here, which makes the arch hold together. No? And the way that he describes this keystone, so it's like it's obviously like a key, no? Like, so it's coding language, and it's a keystone because different from the columns which bear the weight, no? So they stand up to the gravity. This keystone neutralizes gravity. No, so there is a sublimation or a neutralization embodied by the fitting of an element into a constellation that subjects, of course, to the physical laws in its form. So it's a counter gravity physics that becomes thinkable with it. And I think it's with such a notion of meteorons now in the abstract. We need to abstract it from this particular particular application, but with such a notion of the meteoron that in the time of the Analemma, we can start to go back to the relation of intellect and space, where neither intellect dominates space nor space dominates intellect. And this means we need to let go of the active evocation of a notion of the absolute. Now, that is perhaps the most difficult thing to do, but it's also what inspires probably most storytelling ever. No? So storytelling is always about the same kind of things. It's about competitions, it's about love, it's about jealousy, it's about all the human things. It's about being ungebändigt, not tame. No? So it's exploring all these things, but it does this differently every time it does it. Yeah. So to say, yeah, the notion of the absolute and storytelling don't go so well together. And the beauty of this outlook is to say that letting the absolute go gives us a literacy and a kind of a literature that involves storytelling that manifests in buildings, in objects, in things, as much as in tales and stories, of course. And with two slides, I want to close my lecture. One is again from Michel Serres, where he wrote a very interesting text on a novel by Virginia Woolf, which is entitled To the Lighthouse. And this lighthouse, so this relation, how the lighthouse, which of course helps seafarers to come back to the coast, no, in safety when a storm is coming. So it has a kind of like an atlas point, on an exteriority point to the totality of the weather and of climate. So an orientation which does not directly result from the body of how we think the world, with the Occident and the Orient and the directions and the geographical models, but it's an orientation which speaks from an outside, but out with the world. This, I think, is what the lighthouse symbolizes, or also tells of in Virginia Woolf's book. And Serres, he found this really nice word for it. He says it's simply a story where time passes. It's a storytelling about how time passes, and it finds images for that. And these images, they manifest as a house. So she said, to measure the passage of time, she, that means Virginia Woolf, or the main protagonist of the story, needed a clock. She used a house. No, it's Virginia Woolf, obviously. So it's a house as a clock, in order to measure time in a way which is entirely qualitative, but this qualitativeness is only approachable quantitatively through maintaining an exterior relation to it. And this is what I would suggest we need to figure out in relation to language, as much as to forms in geometry and numbers in mathematics and symbols in algebra, and so on. And that is why in my background I have images of the canon of Polyclade. So we need to think about the house. We need to think about the domestic space, which is not entirely private. So a domestic space where there is a publicness and a privacy that are being proportioned in the domesticity of that space. Something like that. And this means a notion of human adequacy. So to think adequacy and proportionateness universally in mathematical terms, but to temper it, to bring it in a relation, to scale it with what we want to care for as a human world. So this is what I would like to end with. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vera. I really enjoyed this lecture, and I did not have much time to contemplate a question, but I would like to start first. I was really, taken by some kind of analogies I seen here, which are very strong. One and I only saw it at the end when you showed the Elias's idea of the arch and its inversion. So somehow we have the arch, which is made out of stones, and obviously the inversion, which is the catenary arc, which basically gives it form from a kind of inverse standpoint. And then the keystone, which is the neutral element, which is basically, we are talking about group theory. Now we are talking about inversion, we are talking about neutral element. And then the start of your talk, which started with the style, which is kind of an inversion as well of I'm not sure whether of content, but of some part of language. I'm not now sure where I'm going now. But the question for me is, what would for you in language be the neutral element in this case? I'm sorry if it's a trick. It's not meant to be a trick question.
Yeah, I know. No, I think it's a crucial question. I think it's why I want to foreground translation. And translation in a philological sense, where philology is not history. So a philology where one works comparatistically, not in terms of having an original notion of language, no, either a theoretical model of it, like Chomsky and so on, or any other theory of language, no, not like that, but a studying of manifestations of language, but always by asking what is the grammar out of which this statement has been created. So there comes to be a kind of an analogy between mathematical statements and philological statements, because when we allow this mathematical domain not to be basically hanging in the air, no, so consisting in constellations, not having foundations, but being organized and oriented according to constellations, then we also have to think about every demonstration or every proof or every theorem. How has it been thought? No, and then this question parallels the philological question, and then the question is, of course, how can we explore that? And I think we can explore it by translation, and translation in a sense where we translate in order to understand the original, not to somehow convey what the original means. No, it's like so then to translate the text becomes a way to a way of close reading almost, because you go beyond, you project yourself to an outside first before looking at it. So a notion of translation, which then of course can be treated in a quadrivium way. So with a transcription, with coding, with syntaxes, with regulations. But in principle, it would mean you try to make up, to invent the whole vernacular that is adequate for the thing you want to talk about. And I like to work with the notion of vernaculars here, not formalized languages and so on, but they're objective, they're languages which seek an objectivity, but the validity of the objectivity is regional or local or situation specific. Even so, it is of universality. No? And the universality is the abstractness that one seeks. So we need to figure out its grammar without having a preconceived notion of what a grammar would be. So we need to study comparatistically how we can rationalize language. So it's almost like performing, so developing a computational relation to the way that words are alive in our thinking. No, because this, I think, is something that gives a kind of a gravity. At least for a person like me, words are they're like a nature, no? So the words have weight, they have affect. There is an affectuality. There is very strong dislike of words. There is the whole psychology related, and it gives me these kinds of shortcuts, of which Wolfram also says, no, they can be rationalized. They're not absolutely true or not, we don't know, but they're very well tested, so they're very well based and calibrated in an experience that is shared and accumulated. And such an embodied relation to words, I think, is crucial for everybody who has been socialized in developing their thinking in the mediality of words primarily. No, so that doesn't say that it's the only one where this is possible, but it's probably like for you as an architect, it's with the forms and with the drawings. It's just a question of how much time of your life have you spent contemplating something. It forms your body, and words do that too. And but to take an alienation to that, so it's like translating oneself. That's I think, so this question I raised in the beginning, trying to find a voice it presupposes that I don't know what I will want to say. No? So if I want to try to find a voice for this affective embodied relation I have to language, then I would not translate. I feel like I'm expressing myself. And the crucial thing that makes it a quadrivium, a quantitative, that gives it an objectivity and a universality, is to not do that. So to seek a kind of a self-alienation through language, but now considered through philology, in this kind of a twisted or inverted way. So the neutral element in all of that would be the fact that pre-specific to any language, to any grammar, any notion or conception of grammar, is the fact that code is related to a cipher. So it's about an articulation of nothing. So an empirical demonstration will not prove anything more about its reality or its relevancy in an intuitive way. Then a speculation which seems totally incomprehensible to most people. They're of the same kind of status. The storytelling will be the tempering and the bringing into proportion of things. And the storytelling needs not happen in language or in words even. No, it can happen in artifacts, in buildings, in paintings, in music. It doesn't. So code is like information in this information physics, information technology. It's elemental. It's in everything.
Thank you.
Translation of information within the world, something like that.
Thank you. I was so much hoping that you would say that. I kind of hinted, but yeah. Do we have other questions? Please, maybe it's better if you step.
Hi, Vera. Thanks a lot for your talk. I have a question regarding the what's the place, what's the role of syntactic structure in your approach of language and translation? Because actually we know that when we do translation, there are big categories of languages, but for many, within categories, we see amazing similarities of the syntactic structures, and I believe that this appears. It's a very Chomskyan way of dealing with language, of course, but this appears almost as a kind of invariant of the language. And since you are dealing with language and translation, but you didn't mention that aspect of the syntactic structure, I wonder what's the role of it in your global conceptual construct.
Yeah, I think there it's a bit similar. Like, so I would strongly insist that grammar and syntax are not equivalent. And grammar takes away the securities of the syntactical rules, just as much as the syntactical rules allow us to have a kind of a notion or an idea of grammar that feels adequate. No, so they basically destabilize and stabilize one another. And this, I'm hesitating a bit to say it, but I was very intrigued by how again Wolfram in this talk begins to speak of what he calls semantic syntax. No? So to couple syntax with semantics, but without then using it as semantics, so to classify words, no, and to function, so to say what the meaning or the definition of the words is in an orthogonal way, but in a kind of, it's almost like a photovoltaic way. So semantic syntax would be like plants, no? So they would become, so their syntaxes which acquire a kind of an organism, an organization or an organism. So they're not classified, they become embodied. So syntaxes would acquire bodies. And again, it's this canon. We need to think of the body and embodied thinking, which of course does not reduce to a human body. But the point is that we are human. So if we care for human values or for these things, it doesn't, we don't win that much if we learn to think like other animals do. Primarily, no. So, but we can learn to think about ours through these alienations. But these alienations can come from abstraction, not from the empirical world of things that are really there. That I think I would say. So the translation is in a way there's just the operationality or the operability of code and ciphers. That's what I would assume. So Serre speaks of a principle, a metaphysical principle, whose principle is that there can be no principle. No? So code and cipher. So the articulated nothing or the existentialism that pluralizes. No, it's not that there is not one absolute existence. It's an existentialism that is baroque, one could almost say. Many voids, no? Like many vernaculars, they all index the objectivity, but none of them has it all.
Okay, I see. Thanks. Thanks a lot. Clear.
There's another question coming, Vera. It's coming.
Hello, Vera.
Hi, Michael.
Yes, they've asked me to ask you to stop sharing your screen, please. So, my question actually, I was struck by the
sharing the screen. Sorry, I need to do that.
Yes.
Yes, now, sorry.
No problem. So thanks very much for the talk. I'm glad that you were able to join us from afar. I was struck by this isn't the first time that we've been in the same context where we speak about the hanging chain and its inversion in the arch, in the catenary arch. And I was now thinking with the figure that it provides for us at a certain level of abstraction, and I'm wondering if we can think of style in this sense as a kind of finding one's keystone, and to be able to invert the gravity of that which weighs upon us in order to stand gracefully. And I will sort of add to that some of the discussions we've had in the past day about large language models and about ChatGPT, and about how I think in a way AI allows us to give a kind of weight to things. We allow things to organize into a way that there is weight, but that this weightedness of what the neural networks start to sort out for us is not the same kind of weight that is the one that will give us the keystone, or the one that we will allow us to kind of find this neutral element. And I think yesterday we were talking a little bit about a kind of orthogonality between the procedural performativity of a large language model like ChatGPT and the verticality of a kind of, maybe I don't know if this is proper to phrase it in the same way that you were intending it, but of kind of finding one's voice, but sort of building the towers that Wolfram speaks about. And so, in a way, I find it interesting because then we really kind of do, if this thought figure works out this way, then it's a way of rethinking kind of the role of human intelligence that remains somehow orthogonal to the model we make of human intelligence when we project into large data sets the abstract formalisms, mathematical formalisms that we have developed of what we think human intelligence is, or of what human learning is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I think yes, that's, I think, very close to the lines I would also like to put it. So I don't think it makes a lot of sense. I think intellect has to do with artifice, and our intellect is just as artificial. That's how I would consider it. No, our intellect is just as artificial as the artificial intellect, but its embodiment is very different. And these towers of Wolfram, and I would relate them to the semantic syntaxes that I was mentioning to the prior question. Now they have to do with embodiments. So it's not just organs that are outsourced in media. No, it has a kind of an embodiment that is exteriorized in bodies of knowledge, or let's say, or in these structures or houses of formalization, no? That can give us shortcuts, that give us these pockets of reducibility. But where I would not quite agree is with the keystone, because I think it's crucial, for me, it's crucial to multiply them. No, so I don't think it's about finding one's own keystone. That would be, so finding a voice would not be finding one's own keystone. But finding a voice becomes possible once you find keystones with regard to the things that concern you, that you care about, that you think about. So where you can invert the gravity of the status quo of the knowledge or the assumptions or whatever it is. You try to invert it. So gain the lightness back with the keystone in this ciphered abstract thinking. And once you have several of these keystones, I think, then you can start translating. And with this kind of translation, there can be a voice that you can find a voice. And it's not like you have to contemplate and then do it, but it comes automatically. You don't make it. So you acquire a voice which you don't make. It happens to you, but it happens to you because you learn to translate inversely these many weights or many things, rather than resisting or opposing or standing against. No, you invert it and then you juggle. Then you can play, then you translate. And from how you will do that, there will be a character, there will be a temper, there will be a kind of a voice. But you can only find this in an embodied sense when you don't think about that voice expressing your thoughts. It's more like you learn to see what your thoughts actually are from not thinking about them, but letting them handle things. It gives a kind of an observational agency to our interiority, to this introspection. That would be the promise I see in it.
All right. Thank you very much, Vera. Thank you very much, everyone, for the questions.
Thank you very much. Bye.